Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you all, and welcome to this session. I'm here despite my training as an economist. I'm here to reflect on a different paradigm for seeing economics, Bahá'í faith, which has been, in many respects, my moral and ethical guidelines campus in economic thinking. This year constitutes the bicentenary of the founders of the Bahá'í faith. And in this context, I'm going to share with you in the next 3 sessions a bit of history and a bit of teachings and why the Bahá'í faith and its teachings, its guidelines, its principles has central relevance to life as we live it, the issues that we face. This session specifically deals with history founders of the Bahá'í faith and the Bahá'í international community. Before I go to some details, I want to make 3 announcements or 3 statements. One is that I'm no authority on the Bahá'í faith. I'm a student of the Bahá'í faith. I've been the student of the Bahá'í faith for now 47 years. And Baha'is do not have priests. They do not have authoritative individuals. So what I'm sharing it with you is more like my understanding of Baha'i teachings, Baha'i history, and please see it in that light. Secondly, you might know that UCT is recording these, from a video recording, in terms of the law, we need to make sure that you're comfortable with it. As far as I'm concerned, we will record, but if any of you has any objection to being shown and or reflected, well, please be aware of it. And so the third one, of course, is in the time that I have, I will share with you as much as I can fit it into the time. But at any point, if something is not clear, you want to comment, or you want me to slow down or speed up, it's very relaxed. Just make it as interactive as possible. So let me begin by, for those of you who may not know, what is the Bahá'í faith? The best and the most crisp definition of the Bahá'í faith is that it's a faith, it's a set of belief that upholds the unity of God, recognizes the unity of His prophets, and inculcates the principle of the oneness and wholeness of the entire human race. It proclaims the necessity and the inevitability of the unification of mankind. It's really the last sentence that is going to be for me, in the next 3 sessions, the theme that I'll try to focus on, because it is so radical, so revolutionary, and so, at the same time, inspiring. For a student of social science, at the moment, it's a very confusing time in the history of mankind. And as such, I find it incredibly insightful to believe that whatever we go through is not out of chaos or out of confusion. It is part and parcel of the evolutionary process of the spiritual consciousness of human beings. And that we'll come back to as we proceed. The Bahá'í faith was founded in 1844 in the city of Shiraz in Iran. Today it has a worldwide community of over 8 million in every country and territory on earth. And the followers come from, literally from every tribe, every set of belief, and every part of the globe. Encyclopedia Britannica states that the Bahá'í faith is the second most widespread belief or faith on earth. In South Africa, it started in 1903, and at the United Nations, the Bahá'í international community has the status of the observer. So who are the founders of the Baha'i faith? The Bab, meaning the gate, in the Baha'i scriptures refer to him as the herald of the faith or the forerunner, and is the first of the twin prophets of the Baha'i dispensation. Baha'u'llah, meaning the glory of God. For those who have Christian background, this has a biblical origin. And he is the second of the twin prophets, founders of this dispensation. The Bab, who has the status of the herald of the Baha'i faith, in 1844, on May 22nd, he made a pronouncement that brought to an end a process that had started way before that, for 30, 40 years prior to his declaration on the 22nd of May, 1844. An entire scholarly movement had predicted the imminent appearance of a new manifestation of God who would be the promised one of Islam. Not much different from the Christian scholarly predictions that had emerged in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, where they believed that the second coming of Christ was imminent. It was pretty much concurrent. One was in the Middle East, one was in the middle of Europe. But on the 22nd of May, 1844, the Bab brought this process to an end, a categoric end, and to some extent to a dramatic end. That announcement, much like an earthquake, sent tremors in theological, social, as well as political structures of Iran and Iraq at the time. Iran and Iraq at that time were, and to some extent they are still, the heartbeat of Shia Islam. And their claim, the Bab's claim that I am, or he was, the promised one of their belief was as dramatic, as stupendous as the claim of the return of Christ or the appearance of Messiah for those who come from Judaic or Islam or Christian background. So as you can imagine, that announcement followed with an upheaval in the society, precipitated by theological or theologians, clergymen, and at the time, the clergy structures or establishment and the political establishments were incredibly interconnected. And that was the control of the masses at the time. So very soon, the clergy opposition to the claim of the Bab became a political issue, became a social issue. And thousands upon thousands of the Babis were subjected to Holocaust style of assassination and executions and persecutions. In many respects, that process has never stopped since 1844. It has had quiet times and it had intense times, but it had never gone away. As we speak, it still persists. So the Bab's claim challenged the establishment, the religious establishment, the political establishment. And 6 years of imprisonment and persecution of the Bab from city to city, from prison to prison, ultimately the establishment resolved, the political establishment, that the social upheavals that the claim of the Bab precipitated in Iran and in Iraq was not going to end unless until he, the Bab, was eliminated himself. So the decree was to execute him. A very defining moment in the brief history of the Bab's life happened during June, July of 1848. An event that for the Babi history is known as the Badasht conference. It's a conference in which the Bab's claim to be the promised one of Islam was categorically and clearly announced and established. Up to then, there were a lot of speculations whether his claim was to be the forerunner of the promised one, or was he the one? And even amongst his followers, there were disputes as to whether it was a new religion or whether he was a kind of reformist in the Islamic dispensation. It was in this conference in 1848 that his claim was made very clear. And very importantly, some of his new teachings, including the emancipation of women, was pronounced in the most dramatic and categoric way by one of his followers called Tahireh, who was the poet or poetess with very established religious as well as scholarly credentials at the time. Of course, that conference led to new upheavals, the new surge of excitement for his followers and opposition by his enemies, so to speak. And of course, the Bab, for the first time in that short period of time, suggested that the whole notion of religion as we know it should be rethought. Society and politics and the consciousness of humankind needs to be re-examined. The ethics of running business, running politics, running culture. So the Bab's writings on the ethical foundation of new cycle of human consciousness were quite revolutionary. And that, of course, very quickly crossed the line of religious belief to the line of politics and global politics and colonialism. The opposition and the principles that the Bab pronounced made the Babi community of Iran at that time, and partly in Iraq, a force against colonialism that was prevailing at that time. So that very quickly became a socio-political, cultural, religious movement, not just a purely religious movement. Again, I'll come back to some of these important principles of this new dispensation. Against this background, and given that in Iran at that time, over 20,000 Babis were executed, the society was in a state of turmoil, because no city, no major center of Iran was immune to the Babi movements. Ultimately, on the 9th of July, the prime minister at that time got the go-ahead from the king that the Bab had to be executed. With a regiment of 250 soldiers at this barrack in city of Tabriz, he was executed. His bullet-ridden body, in the middle of the night, was rescued by some of his followers, and that body was kept in secret for 50 years, from place to place, mostly in private secret places, and traveled from the northern part of Iran through Iraq, Turkey, and ultimately ended up in 1901 on Mount Carmel in Haifa. At that time, Haifa was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Today, the shrine of the Bab, the place where his body was buried, is one of the holy places and a place of pilgrimage for his followers. For those of you who might have been to Haifa, this is what it looks like now. I'm going to shortly share a brief video of this, if I can get it right. So that is where the resting place of the Bab at the moment is. As I mentioned, it's a holy place of pilgrimage for the Baha'is. And the terraces within which the shrine is located, again, has a biblical origin. It is not by accident that it's designed the way it is designed, nor is it by accident that where it is where it is. I don't have time to go to some of the historic background, but the book of Isaiah describes the day in which the kings shall come disembark at the bay and go up the mountains, and these terraces are designed in terms of those biblical prophecies. But let me move on to Baha'u'llah, given my time. As the second prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah means the glory of God. And his ministry follows the ministry of the Bab, who during his time repeatedly and clearly prophesied that soon him whom God shall make manifest will establish a bigger dispensation and usher in a new cycle in human consciousness known as the cycle of fulfillment, as the cycle of unification. As the establisher of peace and the creator of the cycle of fulfillment. Again, we'll come back to some of this concept in the second and third session to unpack what this all mean, and these terms, what does it mean for our day-to-day life. I'm not a theologian, as you know. I'm more interested in everything from a social, systemic point of view. So with that bias, I'll return to some of these statements in the second and third session. On the 12th of November, Baha'u'llah was born in Iran into a well-known aristocratic family. He was from childhood known for his kindness, his care of the poor, and his lack of care for earthly positions and possessions. He was, and he became a prominent follower of the Bab himself. Amongst the followers of the Bab, he was revered and respected. And of course, when the Bab was executed in 1950, Baha'u'llah soon emerged as a potential successor. The Babi community at that time was pretty much fragmented, beleaguered, and literally, socially, and economically tormented right across the country. In August 1852, two Babis made an assassination against the life of the king at that time, and because Baha'u'llah was known as the leader of the Babis, he was arrested on the charge of being the ringleader of this assassination, and that constituted or started a 40-year of imprisonment from place to place. The path of his banishment from Tehran to Baghdad to Istanbul, Adrianople, and via the Egyptian port of Alexandria, ultimately to the prison city of Akka. Again, it was a collaboration between the Ottoman Empire and the Iranian regime at that time that forced him to get further and further away from his power base, as they saw it. They said the further away he goes from his homeland, the less known he will be, the more he will vanish, and nobody would care. And of course, the city of Akka at that time, or Acre as it was known at the time, was a place for the criminals and it was for sure that if he is banished there, nobody would go and he would disappear. And that collaboration between the two powers of the time caused a great deal of harm, a great deal of hardship for his followers, for his family who had young children. The history of that is way beyond the time that I have, but for historians and for social scientists, the details of the collaboration between the Ottoman Empire and the Iranian regime at that time to bring all kinds of persecution and hardship at a personal and community level to the Babi community and Baha'u'llah himself is something that future dramatists, in my mind, without a doubt, will make many stories out of. But on April 21st, Baha'u'llah was, as a prisoner in Baghdad, made his stupendous announcement. Outside of Baghdad, he made the categoric and open announcement that he was indeed the one that Bab said, him whom God shall make manifest. And that made the announcement, according to Baha'u'llah, was not just an Islamic prophecy. It wasn't the fulfillment of the prophecies of the promised one of Islam. He declared himself as the promised one of all ages, of Christians, of the Buddhists, of the Jews, and all others. And that, of course, was no small claim, and that pronouncement made the opposition by the Ottoman Empire and the persecution of the Baha'is so much more severe. Again, we'll come back to this theme of the new cycle of fulfillment and the pronouncements that Baha'u'llah made in that stupendous day. On 12th of December, 1863, Baha'u'llah was sent or banished to Adrianople as a prisoner. And here, some very important historic events took place. He personally wrote for the first time to all the rulers of the time, rulers of political establishment and religious establishment, not of Muslim, but also of Christian, not of the East, but also of the West. And some of the kings and rulers and emperors who were direct recipients of his letters or tablets, you can see there from Queen Victoria of UK, bearing in mind that at that time Britain was the empire that had 40% of the globe under its rule, to Napoleon III, to the rulers of the Tsar of Russia, and so on and so forth. Again, for me as a student of social science, Baha'u'llah's pronouncements in that time of the history, 1852, to rulers of the time from a socio-political and economic point of view, were as relevant as it is today. And of course, the Americas at that time, not as prominent, and yet Baha'u'llah wrote to rulers of the Americas broadly, both North America and South America, collectively. So that is a turning point in the history of the Baha'i faith in terms of making religion directly relevant to socio-economic of life, to power base, political power base, religious power base, and economic power base. And that paradigm of thinking, that framing of religion, not as a set of beliefs that has no relevance for day-to-day life, or should be separated from what we do in our personal life and in our socio-economic life, is in many ways revolutionary. And up to today, the international Baha'i community, wherever they are, they engage with issues of socio-economic and ethical nature, pretty much within the same framework that Baha'u'llah pronounced back in 1852. My second and third session will focus primarily on those. At the moment, I'm trying to share with you the history of the founders so we can have a paradigm for our analysis. Baha'u'llah remained, despite being a prisoner, popular. His followers traveled on foot, at times for months, from Iran and Iraq and Ottoman Empire at that time, Turkish today, to pay pilgrimage to him. Despite the hardship, the followers continued his path, followed him almost non-stop, and the flow of communication between him and the followers never stopped. It is interesting to note that, of course, because of time, during the time of the Bab very seldom talked to his followers. He always wrote letters to them. They had questions, he would write in writing what the issues were, and he would write voluminously. He has written in 6 years the equivalent of many times of all the revealed verses of all the prophets of the past. And that was his style of revelation, his style of communication, his style of inspiration for his followers. Baha'u'llah, on the other hand, mixed personal engagement with written elaboration and inspiration. So during the 40 years of banishment and imprisonment, Baha'u'llah has many volumes of original writings in his own handwritten, as well as with his secretarial support, but many of oral communication with his followers too. There are inspiring and unique accounts of individuals who had personal interactions with him. And those are as fascinating and inspiring as his written work. I emphasize this because in the past and up to now, we have never had direct account of people who faced manifestations of God. We know Old Testament, New Testament, the Buddhist, the Hindu, and all the other religious beliefs, because there was no written time, there was no camera, there was no printing facilities thousands of years. We have oral account of somebody who heard of somebody who heard something. Whereas here we have for the first time the written original text, we have account of their encounters, and we even have some actually pictures of the individuals as well as the central figures of the Baha'i faith. On the 31st of August, 1868, Baha'u'llah was exiled to Akka, which was a prison city, at that time put aside for criminals who you want them to vanish. And one historian writes that at that time, the city of Akka was such a rotten place that even when birds flew over it, they would not survive, never human beings. So very few people were banished to the city of Akka at that time who managed to survive it. And that's why the Ottoman Empire at that time, they thought if we send them to Akka, that's the end of them, like many others. Of course, between 1879 and 1892, Baha'u'llah, after the revolutions or the revolt of the Young Turks, as they called them in the Ottoman Empire, Baha'u'llah was released, still a prisoner, but under home arrest or house arrest, and stayed at a mansion of Bahji, which at that time was built by one of the local Palestinian prominent individuals, and the family of Baha'u'llah rented this place for him to be under house arrest there. On May 29th, Baha'u'llah passed away and buried in one of the buildings very adjacent to that mansion. Again, I don't know how many of you have been to that place. You would have seen his resting place. That resting place is another point of pilgrimage as well as the point of adoration for the daily obligatory prayers of the international Baha'i community. That place now looks like this. That mansion that you saw is now been converted to a place of pilgrimage, and I'm going to, with your permission, show you another short clip. So let me finish our first session with a brief description of the Baha'i international community. Since the passing of Baha'u'llah in 1892, the international Baha'i community has gone through various phases. Importantly, all the developments since his passing has been based on his written will and testament. Again, once it's for the first time in the history of religious history as we know it, that we have a written will and testament of the founder of the faith, which means immediately you have no room for dispute, you have no room for fragmentation and misinterpretation of how the faith should be guided and what phases and what principles should be followed. Broadly, these are the phases that since 1892 the Baha'i faith has gone through in its evolution of its international Baha'i community. Between 1892 and 1921, Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, was appointed as his successor. He essentially helped establish the principles in the East and the West. He traveled to both Europe and North America to articulate, elaborate, and help establish Baha'i communities in big centers of the time. Upon his passing in 1921, between 1921 and 1957, Shoghi Effendi was appointed as the guardian of the Baha'i faith. Shoghi Effendi is responsible for the translation of Baha'i holy scriptures to English primarily, but also he is the founder of, as we know it, Baha'i administrative order globally. We'll come back to some of these details in the next sessions. Between 1957 and when Shoghi Effendi passed away, and 63, an international council guided the Baha'i community. In 1963, based on the writings of the faith, on the holy text, the Universal House of Justice was elected. And since then, every 5 years, the Universal House of Justice has an international election at an international congress based on the principles articulated in the Baha'i electoral process, where this body is elected as the supreme administrative institution guiding the international Baha'i community. It is important to note that the Baha'is do not have priests, they do not have clergymen. They are not allowed to make money from the running of religious communities. And these administrative bodies therefore work both at international and national level. At the international level, 9 members full-time every 5 years. At the national level, 9 members elected every year. Again, all these bodies are served by individuals on voluntary basis. There is no payment. Local levels, at every village, town, every locality that you have 9 members or more, an assembly, what we call it now local spiritual assembly, is elected that governs and administers the affairs of the community, such as birth, death, prayer meetings, affairs that relates to community life, care of people in distress, and a whole range of responsibilities that in terms of Baha'i scriptures, these institutions are entrusted to carry forward. Again, the importance of it for socioeconomic life, I will unpack as we go to second and third. In every continent, there is a continental board of councillors that deals with transnational issues, cross-border issues on every continent. And these bodies obviously do constant collaboration, communication, and planning on voluntary basis. So that is a snapshot of what the Baha'i community history has been, where it has started, how it has evolved, and how its spiritual and community principles or communal principles help the service and the conduct of faith at personal and community level. At the United Nations, as I mentioned, the international Baha'i community has the observer status. The Baha'is historically have been involved in the League of Nations as well as in the formation, in the charters, the constitutions of the United Nations. This is part of their belief, and they have been active and they remain active in various programs of women's rights, environmental issues, children, issues that relates to the welfare of humankind. And of course, importantly, whether they are a small community or big community, a poor community or a rich community, the Baha'is do get involved in the discourses of the society, in the affairs that affects the welfare of the society. Socio-developmental dimensions of life for the Baha'is is not separated from their belief. Fundamental from the time that Baha'u'llah wrote to kings and rulers of the time to today is that there should be a coherence between what you believe and what you do within the limits of your resources. But you cannot go from Monday to Friday, be something else, and comes weekend and become religious. You cannot be a different human being in your thoughts, in your conduct, in your emotions, when you are religious and when you are not. It is this coherence that is central to the redefinition of religion, the redefinition of humanity, the redefinition of ethics and the life that flows from it. And it's really this overriding principle that it is the age of unification of humankind. As I mentioned, Baha'u'llah as the founder, the establisher of the cycle of human unification or the cycle of fulfillment, ushers in a new thought, a new vision. And that relates to the celebration of diversity of humankind and the fact that our diversity should be seen as a source of strength, enrichment, and mutual empowerment. That is central to life as we live it today. Today, if we look around ourselves in South Africa or go anywhere on the planet, one of the biggest, most intractable issues that faces us human beings is how to manage diversity. From Europe's migration issues to the Middle East, tribal issues, religious beliefs, in South Africa's confrontation with diversity, Africa's challenges of how to deal with enormous amount of differences, how to read them, how to celebrate them, how to use them as a source of enrichment and empowerment, not as a cause for killing and confrontation and destruction, is central to the message of the Baha'i faith. And it's in this context that the Baha'is worldwide, from involvement in the UN projects to all village level neighborhood, is about how do we as human beings create a coherence between what we believe and what we do. As a community, no matter how small or how big, how do we create coherence in what we say we believe and what we end up doing in our communities. It's really this central message of the faith that runs through all the teachings. And in the next session and the session after, I'll do my best to unpack some of it. But for now, Baha'u'llah says, and it's something to remember and reflect on, says, what is the essence of faith? Is the fewness of words and abundance of deeds. That's what we'll reflect on. And tomorrow and the day after, I'll unpack this sentence. Thank you very much. Obviously, if there's any question, comments, I'm at your service. Yes, ma'am.
Question that because we have the writings of the prophets, that there is no problem with interpretation. But if you're dealing with diversity and people coming from diverse backgrounds, and you're dealing with any kind of complexity, there's bound to be differences of interpretation and disagreement.
There is nothing wrong with differences of interpretation as long as you keep it personal. The thing that is unique about the Baha'i faith and the writings, the written will and testament of Baha'u'llah and the will and testament of Abdul Baha clarifies this, is the matters that pertains to the community. There are authoritative sources of interpretation. The Universal House of Justice today, when it makes an announcement, it pertains to the issues of communal societal nature. Now, whether I'm in the DRC or whether I'm in Canada, in Mexico, or in Saudi Arabia, I take that as the authoritative way to deal with societal issues. But does it stop me to interpret it for myself differently? Be my guest. You can interpret it as you like. In fact, the Baha'i faith encourages that personal reflection, innovation, creativity, as long as we do not impose it on others. And that's a very fine but very critical issue, which as human beings, I'll discuss it a bit more next session, as we grow in consciousness, as we realize the spiritual nature of our beings, we then appreciate that diversity of views is an important thing. How else would I get inspired if you don't come up with a new way of looking at the same thing? How else would we progress if we don't allow people coming wild and wonderful interpretation of exactly the same thing, as long as it doesn't impose it on the society. When it comes to the societal side, there is a divine structure that deals with those issues. And now 200 years later, or nearly 200 years later, as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The Baha'i communities covering every culture, every group, every education, or every other grades of human existence, there aren't this branch and that denomination. There isn't differences of communal nature. Are there differences of personal interpretation? Of course, and that's wonderful. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.